it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. October is upon us, and those long winter nights up here in the northern hemisphere are starting to close in around us. It's raining outside, so where better to be than next to a warm fire, listening to me tell you stories to help you fall asleep. We begin tonight's anthology with A Bar at the End of the World by Spencer Romber, followed by a series of stories, some of which are featured on my second channel, Dr Creepen's Dungeon, brought here together to you for your listening delight. The widescreen TV behind the old wooden bar was blaring news from abroad, news that was about to become very pertinent. And as American forces continue to press eastward after recapturing the Estonian city of Narva, one wonders if the Russians will truly follow through on their threat to nuke advancing American positions should they cross the Russian border, despite announcements by the American government to the contrary. It's unclear whether this has any relevance to reports of Iskander missiles being brought towards the Russian-Latvian border. Just give me another beer. The sound of the TV was broken up by the gruff voice of Michael Christensen, a white, tall, middle-aged man sitting at the bar, speaking to a bartender in front of him. The young male bartender in front of him, roughly the same height and complexion, responded, "Sure thing." Michael watched as the bartender walked off to grab another beer. As Michael watched, he sighed, looking back up at the television. Footage of NATO and Russian soldiers fighting from house to house was playing now, while a news reporter's voice overlaid the footage. The whole reason he was drinking in the first place is that he knew all too well what was coming. Michael had served in Afghanistan and Iraq as an officer, and he'd been present as a military advisor when the tensions in Eastern Europe began to spiral out of control, before he'd finally retired as a colonel at the end of an honorable 20-year career, though he'd taken up a job as a civilian consultant since then. He'd seen the horrors of war, and just what people were willing to do, but nothing had scared him then, at least not publicly, something that had earned him the moniker of steady hands within the United States military. But what he'd seen in the last 48 hours coming out of Estonia had greatly scared him and broken his normally calm demeanor. A month earlier, tensions in Narva had spiraled out of control. The local Russian minority population, fed up with years of what they perceived as oppression by the Estonian government, began to protest. However, the Estonian government had responded poorly to the protests, engaging in repression tactics, and the protests, which had been peaceful, quickly turned violent. When shooting broke out, the few available Estonian military forces in the area and the police were quickly overwhelmed, something not helped by the Russians sending in little green men to escalate the situation. The media had framed the issue as another Ukraine, only this time NATO was being directly impacted. It had become apparent that Estonia was very much on the brink of civil war, and NATO was preparing to intervene. No one had thought that Russia would dare overtly invade, not when such a maneuver would immediately invoke the wrath of the United States and risk nuclear war. But invade they had, and Estonia fought with everything they had, though it had not been enough. Estonia fell. America's response was immediate, and 2 weeks prior to when Michael was drinking his cares away, American troops, already stationed in Europe, had gone on the warpath after Congress authorized a declaration of war, immediately liberating the Estonian capital of Tallinn, while European NATO forces moved to push to the north from Latvia. Meanwhile, at home, the draft had been enacted. People like the bartender that was serving Michael drinks were being drafted in the millions, sent to train for what many were beginning to call the Third World War. Protests, which sometimes turned into outright riots, in favor of ending the war, had broken out as well, and even those in favor of defending Estonia were all too aware of what the situation could lead to. The public had been further alarmed about the possibility of the worst when the Chinese outright placed troops on the Russian border a week ago. Many had deemed it as a silent support of NATO's established position regarding Estonia. Everyone was picking sides, and when the real punches started being thrown, no one was going to be safe. something made all the more relevant when Russian and American naval forces clashed in the Arctic Ocean, a place that had been perceived as isolated by the average American. The worst, however, had come 2 days ago when the media, seemingly acting as another nation in the conflict with how many people they'd sent over into Eastern Europe, reported that the Russians were readying Iskander, tactical nuclear missiles in Kaliningrad, an area NATO had refrained from attacking out of fear of a nuclear response. NATO had responded with their own tactical nuclear missile deployment, but that meant that the two militaries, having fought conventionally for a month, now stared at each other, waiting to see who would press the button. And now, while NATO and Russian troops battled in Estonia and threatened to move into Russia, Michael sat there drinking, watching the world fall apart around him. If the world was going to end, he wanted to make sure he was completely hammered when it did. The bartender returned to Michael's seat and put the open beer in front of him. Michael thanked him and took it gladly, and took a large swig from it. He hoped that the bartender hadn't been keeping track of how many beers he'd had. The longer he could just stay here and just medicate himself, the better. It's not like there was anything for him at home. Delilah, his wife of 12 years, had been dead for 7, and his only child, 19-year-old Sable, had more or less left home for University of British Columbia to study medical physics as soon as she graduated high school, and Michael had only spoken with her from time to time. He hadn't been the best parent, and had been far too preoccupied with his work, something that had gotten worse when his wife died. He hadn't blamed his daughter for leaving. He'd blamed himself. Another sigh left Michael's mouth, and he took another swig. The bottle in front of him was now nearly empty. Looking back up towards the TV again, his vision a bit blurry from the alcohol in his system, he saw the look of a shocked news anchor, his eyes staring at the paper in front of him. Michael had taken a minute to wonder just what the anchor was freaking out about, when he noticed that everyone around him had the exact same look. Open eyes, never blinking, just staring at the various televisions scattered throughout the neatly Los Angeles sports-themed bar. Even the bartender just stared at the television. While Michael was almost certainly drunk, he knew damn well something was wrong. In a slurry voice, Michael tried to make himself heard. "Can anyone explain what's going on?" The bartender in front of him turned around and spoke to Michael. The shocked face that the bartender had worn was still very much prevalent. "Haven't you been paying attention? Look!" Michael's attention returned to the television. The news anchor had collected himself long enough to start speaking, though he was clearly nervous. "We've received disturbing reports that, and I can't believe I'm saying this." The news anchor took another deep breath. Tactical nuclear weapons have been used in Eastern Europe. The extent of the damage is not yet known, nor are the number of casualties, but there have been reports of as many as 6 confirmed detonations across the Estonian-Russian border, with many more unconfirmed. It is clear that something has gone horribly wrong as... The news anchor broke down in tears. What little composure he had was gone, and in the bar, everyone just continued to stare blankly, save one man near the back who just mouthed the words, "Jesus Christ." The news anchor wiped the tears from his eyes and spoke once more. "We now go to our correspondent live near the Estonian-Russian border, Alicia Stanway. Alicia?" The screen now changed to the face of an emotionally scarred white woman in her early 20s. She only looked slightly more composed than the anchor from earlier, something almost incomprehensible given the series of mushroom clouds rising in the distance behind her, and the barely audible screams of the dead and dying behind her. "Dan, a few minutes ago, as you can see behind me, the Russian government followed through on their threat to nuke American positions that were appearing to cross the Russian border. Soon after, the American military retaliated and..." Alicia took a minute to compose herself again before saying, "But Dan, I was just preparing to move away from the front, and the sky just lit up. It just lit up like there was a second sun." The screen cut back to Dan, the crying male anchor from earlier. "Are you all right?" Once more, the screen returned to Alicia. "I'm fine, but Alicia took a deep breath. Christ, I've never seen anything so horrifying in my life. Just 1 second, I was about to film in front of the Narva River, and suddenly everything was on fire. It was just... Alicia broke down again. I'm sorry, I can't go on. The TV cut for a final time to Dan as Alicia's descent into madness was cut short by a man in a studio pressing a button. In the bar around Michael, the stares at the television had turned into sobs. Outside, the first signs of panic and rioting were occurring. It was inherently clear what was coming next. I've just received word that we're going off the air now. It's not clear if we will ever return to the air. In what may be our final hours, I'd just like to say it's been an honor to bring the news to you for the last 10 years, and I hope to get to do so again. God bless you all, and God bless the United States of America. As soon as Dan had finished, the television in front of him switched to an emergency broadcast. Replacing the face of the shocked anchor was now a blank screen with the words Emergency Alert System in white, and the words Primary Entry Point System issued in an emergency action notification also in white below it. A computerized voice began to blare information that had been deemed as life-saving. This is an emergency action notification. This station has interrupted its regular programming at the request of the White House to participate in the emergency alert system. During this emergency, most stations will remain on air. Outside, the attack warning sirens were beginning to sound. Michael stared blankly at the beer bottle in front of him. The bartender who'd been serving him had long since fled, and the people around him had taken to looting or fleeing for a fallout shelter. Not that it would do any good, given that this was Los Angeles, a prime target for any nuclear attack. Michael thought to himself, hearing the glass break behind him. I suppose this is it. Not like there's anything I can do now. 2 cars outside of the building crashed, the sounds of slamming metal doing enough to at least pause the panic momentarily. One of the drivers got out, went into a front with the other man, only for the other man to just take out a gun and shoot him before leaving. Michael saw none of this, too focused on the beer bottle and the television in front of him. Everyone else did, and 2 or 3 people ran back into the bar, seeking shelter from the road rage-provoked man, seeking to have his last few minutes be nothing more than a killing spree. At 7:43 Pacific Standard Time, NORAD detected the launch of more than 20 Russian ICBMs. It is currently unknown what the targets of these launches are, but it is believed that these missiles are nuclear, and anyone within 50 miles of a city with a population greater than 250,000 are urged to seek shelter. A group of people that had entered the bar ripped open the door to one of the freezers, thinking that the inches of steel would protect them from any kind of nuclear attack, though that was doubtful. It was an act of desperation. Logic had nothing to do with it. Logic had not saved humanity from setting itself alight. Gather 14 days' worth of non-perishable food and water, along with a flashlight and a battery-operated radio. A grocery store across the street from the bar found itself under siege from a group of people searching for last-ditch supplies, thinking that they'd somehow get the necessary supplies to survive the aftermath of the attack, before the attack had actually hit. Within a few minutes, the store was on fire as looters with Molotov cocktails competed with panicking shoppers. Repeating, at 7:43, Michael finished up the rest of his bottle and, in an ironic twist to all the rioting and looting going on, put the bottle in a trash can next to him. He sighed once more, his sigh only being slightly louder than the sirens in the background. He knew that there wasn't anything he could do now. As a former member of the military, he knew that all too well. As the sirens continued to sound, and Michael sat in his seat while the world went to hell around him, his thoughts drifted to his wife and his daughter. Sable was safe in British Columbia. She'd survive. He'd taken the time to contact her one last time as soon as everything had gone to hell a few days prior, and get her into a compound outside of Fort Nelson with someone he'd known from his military days. Michael would have come along, but he knew all too well that it was too late for him. Even if he'd wanted to go, Canada had long since closed her borders to civilian traffic to aid with the war effort, as had every other NATO country, and he wasn't even sure if he wanted to survive anyway. After all, in a nuclear war, wouldn't the living envy the dead? Fallout is a byproduct of nuclear explosions and can spread for hundreds of miles. Prolonged exposure to fallout will result in death. As for Michael's wife, Delilah, Michael deeply missed her. Raising Sable by himself had been difficult, and his own work meant that by the time Sable had grown up, he hadn't been able to be the best father he could have been. If Delilah had still been alive, things would probably have been different. This station will cease transmission following the conclusion of this message. Please tune to 1610 AM for further information on this incoming attack. Michael got up from his chair amidst a sea of panicking people. It was time. He stumbled a bit as he moved to walk out the door, the alcohol still in his system leaving his balance a wreck, but he still got there regardless. As he opened the door, he was met with a city on fire, debris from the rioting all over the streets. The sirens were still blaring, but people had long since ignored them, too focused on their own survival or just making their last moments worth it in their own way. Michael thought it was rather funny, and he silently wondered if the damage from the imminent nuclear explosion would actually change the city all that much with the damage already done. As Michael looked up and saw the heated plasma of the Russian ICBM re-entering the atmosphere, he thought to himself once more, "Delilah, I'm coming home." And in a flash of light and heat, Michael was gone. Our next creepy story today is Mr. Sandman, an original work by Andy 546789. The jungle wasn't used to visitors. For thousands of years, its vibrant emerald vegetation had laid undefiled by the corrupting gaze of mankind. Those few foolish enough to wander in, lured perhaps by the legends of a hidden treasure that awaited them at its heart, became ensnared in the thorny embrace of its arms, never to be heard from again. There were those who worshipped the jungle and the thing that lived residing deep inside it, the tribe that lived just on its outskirts. They prayed to it, asking for mercy and protection. The jungle enjoyed their fear, thrived off it. But today was different. There was someone new traversing its ancient shadowed trees, and she was not afraid. Eva Barker had been wandering this godforsaken jungle for 3 whole days when she found the entryway. She would have found it sooner if that damn shaman hadn't been so vague with his directions. It was so obscurely hidden beneath the thick, gnarled foliage that she would have been forgiven for missing it. No, not forgiven. She would not have that kind of luxury. Forgiveness wasn't in Cecile's vocabulary. That bastard. And if she had sauntered out of the jungle empty-handed, he would have put a bullet in her brain, just like it did to Samantha. Oh God, Samantha. She'd stopped herself from recalling the events of the past few days, just busied herself with the mission at hand. But she couldn't take it anymore. All the memories came roaring to the front, and she began to violently strike at the large mottled tree next to her, banging her fist on the sturdy wood over and over again until her hands were covered in blood. She shouted until her throat was sore and her nerves were fried. "Damn it, Samantha! Why?" she rasped. She sank to the jungle floor, exhausted. "Look at me," she thought to herself. "I'm so pathetic." If her father was still alive to see how far she'd fallen from the family tree, he would have disowned her on the spot. Unlike the world-renowned anthropologist Stephen Barker, who had come by his treasures legally, Eva had veered onto a path paved by deceit and thievery. For 15 long years, she and her partner Samantha King had raided the most ancient tombs and stolen the most guarded secrets of the world. She had no regrets, and if given the chance, would do it all over again. She loved it all. The sweet thrill of discovery, the adrenaline of the chase. But, well, Samantha had grown tired of it all and yearned for a more normal life. At first, Eva couldn't understand why anyone would want a normal life. What was that, even? A steady job, a couple of kids in a nice house with a white picket fence in a gated community. Fuck, no. But Eva loved Samantha with all her heart. Ever since she'd first laid eyes on her in that alluring red dress at that dull party at the American Museum of Natural History all those years ago. She was willing to set aside her own aspirations to be with her. Oh, they had promised each other that this would be the last time. A pristine jungle in the wilds of South America that was said to hide the greatest wealth the world had ever known. They would go and take their shares and live out the rest of their lives on some pig farm or whatever the fuck in Texas. But now, Samantha was gone, murdered by Cecil Bright. Eva knew from the beginning that he couldn't be trusted, knew that he was nothing more than a conniving two-bit fuck. And it turned out she was right. At first, he played by their rules. Over the course of several weeks, the trio had gained the trust and admiration of the tribe that lived on the jungle's outskirts. They'd learned their customs and rituals, even entertained their inane talk of an ancient evil that lived deep in the thicket. A creature made of sand that possessed the secrets of life and death. But those were just stories, superstitious nonsense by a people who didn't know any better. As time went on, Cecil grew more and more unstable, his patience wearing thin. And then, one day, he lost his mind and beat the shaman to a bloody pulp, forcing him at gunpoint to divulge the location of the treasure. For the shaman's compliance, he was rewarded with a bullet. The pale white walls of the hut dyed red with his blood. Eva couldn't believe her eyes. Call her a thief and a liar all you want, but she was no murderer. Samantha had tried to reason with Cecil, but whatever reason he had left in his little brain had fled long ago. He gunned Samantha down, putting a bullet through her spine. As she lay dying, he laughed in her face and finished the job. He gave Eva an ultimatum. Go and retrieve the treasure for him, or end up like the rest. Eva reluctantly agreed. And now here she was, 3 days later, a teary, sweaty mess lying on the jungle floor. She got up to her feet and went over to inspect the entryway. It was a large gaping hole hiding on the side of a rocky wall, covered in thick, thorny vines that curled themselves tightly around the doorway. Eva took a machete and started whacking at the constricting cuticles. But instead of chopped bark, her hits sent hot crimson blood spurting into her face. After a few more hits, an unearthly wail echoed from inside the gaping blackness of the entryway, a scream so haunting that it sent shivers down her spine. Then the vines began to move and unknotted their twisted fingers, leaving the entryway wide open. Eva peered inside. Blackness as dark as night stared back, taunting her to come inside if she dared. She took a moment to steady her nerves, and with a final sigh of resignation, she plunged into the darkness. She wandered for what seemed like days, traversing the blackness with only the lonely beam of her flashlight as company. But well, it might as well have been off. It did nothing to alleviate the oppressiveness of the place. There was nothing to hold on to, nothing to see. It was as if she was floating in a darkened void, lost in its shadow. At long last, she saw a glimmer of light up ahead of her, a sliver of hope in this dismal place. She ran towards it. Anything was better than this wicked twilight zone. When she got closer to the light, she saw that it was emanating from an open passageway. The first thing she noticed as she stepped through was the acrid aroma of decay that scented the fetid air. It struck her by surprise, and she fell into a coughing fit, gagging and trying her best not to vomit. She wrapped a scarf around the lower part of her face to mask the smell. As she gained composure, she saw that she was in a long, spacious room piled high with gold. Well, it spilled out of every corner, had invaded every last crevice of the place. She couldn't believe her eyes. The legends were true. There were enough riches here to last multiple lifetimes. As she continued to scan the place, her eyes landed on the source of that disgusting smell. There, in the center of the room, was the body of a man, or at least what used to be a man. Its long, emaciated body lay sitting on a throne of pain. Hundreds of snake-like vines were wrapped around it, driving their needle-sharp thorns into every inch of its virgin flesh. Its bones were contorted, distorted into impossible positions. Where its eyes and mouth should have been, only jagged, blood-encrusted holes remained. Eva couldn't help but be drawn to this thing. She was mesmerized by its defiled body. Despite the pain that ravaged its soul, it seemed at peace, so content, so serene, so beautiful. As she neared the creature, she could see its chest rise and fall, could hear its harsh, ragged sighs. So it was still alive. How could something like this be in so much pain and still be alive? As if hearing her thoughts, the thing lifted its head and stared at her through its bloody, empty holes. It began to laugh, a haunting and maniacal cackle. Its body shook and contorted, its bones snapping from the movement. Sand spewed forth from every hole in its body as the laughter grew louder and louder into a cacophonous cackle that permeated into Eva's very soul. Raised its bony fingers and beckoned her towards it. The entire room had started to fill with rosy, blood-freckled sand, but she didn't care. All that mattered was the creature. She embraced it, letting the thorns cut into her skin, piercing every inch of her body. She ran her delicate fingers over its scarred, cratered face and plunged her arms deep into its cavernous eye cavities. From out of the holes, she produced a chunky stream of rotted gore. Suddenly, an immense hunger panged her, driving deep into her gut. She regarded the offal for another moment, and then began to feed, devouring it without a second thought. She hadn't eaten for days and was starving. Pleasure racked her body, and she groaned, wiping the blood all over her face and body. She leaned down and kissed it, slipping her tongue deep into its mouth hole, savoring every lick and suck. Sand began to spew out from it, flowing into her mouth and down her throat. She sputtered, choking, drowning in the sand that was filling her body and coursing through her veins. But she wasn't afraid. No, Eva felt a calmness engulf her entire being. Then the sand invaded every part of her being, and she was no more. Cecil paced furiously up and down the hut. Where was she? Where the fuck was she? It had been 3 whole days, and she still hadn't returned. It was a simple task. Go in, take the treasure, leave. Oh, she had probably taken it all for herself and fled. Hadn't she, that bitch? He thought. He should have gone and done it himself. He reached for his gun and prepared to leave this backward place. Never send a woman to do a man's job, he thought bitterly. But as he opened the flaps of the hut, a sharp, horrendous smell punctuated the air. He turned and came face to face with Eva, or at least what was left of her. Her limbs were stretched out of proportion, long and spindly spider legs and arms. Her belly was bloated and bulging, and a large, caved-in bloody hole was where her face used to be. "Eva," Cecil asked, "is that you? What the fuck happened?" But the Eva thing didn't respond. It only stood there, motionless. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was upon him, tearing into his flesh. He tried to fire at it, but the bullets had no effect. They were simply absorbed into the scarred body. Eva tore his body limb from limb, and Cecile screamed and screamed and screamed. Well, the tribespeople had heard poor Cecile's cries for help, but they were too afraid to enter the hut. At long last the screams died out, and all was quiet. Eva stepped out from the hut, her mutilated body drenched in sand and blood. The tribespeople gasped and fell to their knees in reverence and awe. The prophecy had proven true, and their queen had finally returned. The jungle was alive. It was finally free, and it felt so very, very hungry. Next up we have Family Reunion, an original story by Arcana 120. Each year my family would book the week-long vacation to my father's ancestral home up north. Just around October, my mum would write a letter to our school excusing us for said event. Same with my dad's office. It's an absolute must that we attend this. Not just for our family, Mum would tell my sister and I, no, this is for our future. It's also a must that we bring along something dear to us that we would need to leave behind. Sort of like an offering or a tribute to the reunion. And it's not just any something, it must be of real value to us. Well, at first I didn't know what it meant. As children we would bring beloved toys or books or dresses which, to my young mind, was really important to what I would ask to Granny. That's what I call the oldest living head of Dad's family. Though she looks like 50 or 60 years old, my cousins and aunts would say that she's older than that, and I mean way old. Even saw the Spanish-American War, one of my aunts would say, as she'd serve us macaroni salads or dessert and have us gathered around for stories and fun. Not this year. It was different. See, I was previously employed at a company in one of the major booming towns here in the country, and it was all going so well until I was terminated from the job simply because I wasn't kissing up to my manager and accepting his offer. Well, to make matters worse, he'd hired a few of his loyal men and did me a number. Mum and Dad were livid with what happened, but with no proof other than text messages and phone calls and allegations, as the local law enforcement say. My family had no choice but to clam it up and move us out to a different suburb to hide from the prying eyes. My twin did the part of acting as me for the first month, no biggie, though as the event came, I realized I was 2 months pregnant with what was a bad joke. As we were nearing the huge ancestral home, my sister chatting with my mum about the plans for her new business, Dad held my hand. I was sitting shotgun beside my dad. He smiled sadly and said, in a rather different tone than the ones we were used to hearing from him, "Go up to Granny's room. You'll be the first one in. The others will not be arriving till tomorrow afternoon." As soon as the van stopped in the driveway, I made a dash to the old double-panel doors, ran up the 2 flights of stairs and made a beeline to Granny's room, which is at the end left of the hallway. Granny Martha was how I remembered her, sitting in her grand rocking chair, her long white hair in a grand bundle on her austere head, wearing one of her grand gowns that I remember her wearing as a child, making me think of her as a long-lost queen from a far-away kingdom. Well, I burst into tears at seeing her. Granny! Sobbing, I ran up to her, knelt by her rocking chair, and in tears told her what had happened. Her crone fingers stroked my long ebony locks, and in a voice that I'd heard in my dreams so many times, for as long as I can remember, she said in a commanding yet soft tone, "Hush, Marius. You are safe, safe and loved. Everything will be all right." and it was then that I felt a cold pair of hands roaming down my back and encircling my abdomen. "Your offer has been accepted. Rest, and everything will be all right." And at that, a wave of drowsiness, such as I'd never felt before, hit me, and I found myself falling at her cushioned feet. My last look was my granny giving me a book, but it was different, somehow twisted. I woke to my sister waking me up from my bed and telling me that lunch was ready. Lunch? But I recalled we'd arrived there an hour after sundown. God, how long was I out? Mum came in and asked my sister to leave us and attend to our cousins. After closing the door, Mum sat beside me and asked, "Do you remember what happened?" I shook my head slightly and said weakly, "It felt like a dream. I remember talking to Granny, then feeling sleepy. Oh," was what came out of me as I remembered the details. Then my hand flew to my midsection and then went lower down. Surely I remember the bump. "The offer's been accepted, dear," Mum said, taking my hand and squeezing it tightly. "You'll see and understand." And with that, she helped me dress and attend to my family. The week went by in a flurry, and for once I felt as if a huge problem had been lifted from me. A new hope, a new beginning. Alas, the holiday must end, and off we were, packing stuff and hugging and kissing our relatives off. As we were about to leave, Mum handed me a rather large box. "Dad said for you to read the letter before opening the package." And I did, and I understood what had happened. The letter explained that I have a large sum of money waiting for me upon my return, enough for me to start a new life and pursue my dreams of being an animator and graphic artist. Along with the financial assistance came a laptop that's fitted for a graphics animator, complete with software, and a scholarship for any school of my choice that offers the class. The letter's ending read, "You need not hide from anyone anymore. You are free of your past hurts. It's been taken care of." Signed, Granny M. When we arrived home, the first thing I did was buy a pregnancy kit. Quickly, I locked the bathroom door, feigning diarrhea, and I ran the test. It came out negative. Stunned as I was, I understood what had happened. It was not the only surprise that I received. The manager and his goons were locked in prison for assault and harassment, but not before they'd been maimed. Well, they're still serving their sentence to this day. Now I happily work from home in my home office, my sister contracting me from time to time on projects. My graphic artist abilities have earned me the title of Senior Graphic Artist Consultant at a couple of agencies in the city, and having my work and art contracts sought after by medium and large companies alike. We still attend the reunion each year, with me calling Granny almost every week. And each night, just before going to bed, I would see someone scratching on my window, tapping out a message. "Your Granny has sent us to watch over you." Tonight's next tale of terror is The Candyman, How Cotton Candy Ruined My Life, by Mandog. This happened to me around 30 years ago, back when I was just a child. I've never felt comfortable talking about this, as traumatic as it was for me, but I think it's beyond time I let this off of my chest. It's up to you if you want to believe this or not. By now I'm used to people thinking I'm all kinds of crazy. So, back in the late 80s, before the Babri Mosque had been demolished, my family was living comfortably in a small town in central India. This was before the internet. Well, our family couldn't even afford a television, so the only entertainment we had as kids was other kids. As it goes for small towns like ours, almost everyone knew everyone else, and we always had a large group of kids to play with. By far our most favourite activity was playing cricket, as it was and continues to be for most South Asian kids. Every week we'd each get 10 rupees, with the condition being that the losing team had to pool its money and treat the winners. It added stakes to our matches, and even led to fights, but it sure was something to look forward to each Sunday. My father was against this, arguing that it teaches kids to gamble, so I had to sneak off to my much more soft-hearted mum to pay my share. So, on every Sunday at around 4 p.m, I would take my cricket bat, strap it to the back of my cycle, and ride to the playground. Our cricket field was just a wide open space next to a seldom-used basketball court, about 2 to 3 kilometers away from my house. My parents aren't particularly irresponsible, so it's still a wonder to me that I was allowed to go all that way at such a young age. The little playground was oddly positioned. The only buildings near it were an old post office and some abandoned houses. If it hadn't been for us kids, our town would have just forgotten about that area. The streetlights on the road nearby were the only artificial source of light there, so believe me when I say this. When it got dark, it would get very creepy and none of us liked to stay there after sunset. It was a Sunday like any other. After a lot of begging and pleading, I convinced my mother to give me the money and happily ridden my bike to the field. I remember being one of the first ones to arrive that day, standing at the stumps and impatiently waiting for the others. There were about 20 of us, all from different socio-economic and religious backgrounds, all united by boredom and cricket. I would never have such a diverse group of friends ever again in my life, especially with what happened in Ayodhya a couple of years later. Well, we won the match that day, and I remember playing exceptionally well myself. The sun had started to go down, the sky was a sickly shade of orange, and we were chatting about the match and deciding where to go for the treat, when I felt an intense urge to pee. Asking my friends to wait for me, I decided to go relieve myself on the walls of the old post office. Yes, I had terrible civic sense back then. As I unzipped my pants, I could hear them laughing and going away, thinking it would be hilarious to leave me in the dark. I quickly did my business, zipped up my pants and turned around, ready to leave. And that's when I saw him. He was standing next to a bicycle, with a wall of cotton candy behind him, somehow attached to his cycle. His face was tilted to the left. He had this strangest squint, with both of his eyes pushing painfully rightward, such that his pupils were just tiny black specks in the white expanse of his eyes. He had a very dry mouth that pushed inward, as if he was an old man without any teeth, which was bizarre since he clearly looked very young. I stood frozen to the spot as I saw him, unable to believe what I was looking at. The next second, my heart jumped as he rang the bell on his bicycle. Tring, tring, tring. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Imagine you're all alone in the middle of an empty field, and a strange, squinty-eyed man with his head tilted to the side is standing in front of you, ringing the bell on his bicycle, while not even looking at you. Tring, 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 in short bursts of 3. Tring, tring, tring. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just a candy seller, bang in the middle of an empty, dark playground with no one here but the two of us. My parents had always warned me about strangers who tried to kidnap kids by giving them poison candy. This was much more terrifying than that. After a short while, I gathered up what little courage I had. What do you want?" I asked, my voice much more lower-pitched than what it usually was. At that, he stopped ringing the bell, and for a few moments the both of us stood motionless, in complete silence. Then, suddenly, his face jerked into a straight position, and his pupils moved to the center of his eyes, focusing all his attention on me. "Tring, tring, tring," he whispered, his soft voice still sounding loud and clear in my ears. "Tring, tring, tring. Tring, tring, tring." His mouth turned into the most frightening, toothless smile I had ever seen as he kept on whispering. "Tring, tring, tring. Tring, tring, tring." All rational thought fled my body as I just ran from there, forgetting everything. I forgot that I'd left my bike back there, forgot where I was running to. I just ran, with survival the only thing on my brain. Oh, I didn't know how I knew it, but I knew that if I delayed running by even a second, I was certain to die. Pain exploded in my legs as my feet pounded the ground, desperate as I was to flee from this situation. I was screaming and crying as I ran, not looking behind me, yet somehow knowing he was right on my heels. My fears were confirmed when I heard him whisper, right next to my ears, "Tring, tring, 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 tring." I stumbled and fell. Fear and hopelessness took over my body. I felt like a cornered animal who knew he was about to be hunted by a predator. Reluctantly, I looked around and saw that he wasn't anywhere close to me. He was still standing there, staring at the spot where I'd stood just a moment ago. I didn't stick around to see what would happen next, and ran from there, only stopping at the front door of my house, where I collapsed in exhaustion. My mother herself was scared out of her wits when she found me on the doorstep, reduced to a blubbering mess. Through my tears, I tried explaining what had happened, not knowing how much she understood. I would find out later that my parents thought someone was trying to kidnap me. Oh, if only it was something that rational. My Ammi hugged me, and I finally calmed down. Even my older sister, Fatima, was sympathetic towards me for once. That evening, my Abu went out and got my bicycle back. He was furious at me that I was going out and playing cricket using money, that I was going all the way there alone, even though he'd never objected to that before. But, most of all, furious that he'd almost lost me. He took me to the police station to file a complaint, but the cops weren't interested. We came from an underprivileged family, and I hadn't even been hurt in any way, so they pretty much run us out of the station. That night, I lay in bed with my eyes wide open. I'd seen far too much that day to sleep comfortably. I don't know how much time had passed, with me just staring at the ceiling, when I heard that scarily familiar sound again. Tring, tring, tring. Tring, tring, tring. It was, unmistakably, the sound of that god-awful bell again, this time coming from right outside my bedroom. I closed my eyes, pulled my blanket above my head, pretending that I hadn't heard anything. The sound continued for what felt like hours, finally ceasing after I refused to take the bait. It had been a good while after the sound of the bell had stopped, when I peeked out of the blanket after pulling the curtains aside. He was still there, silently standing next to his bike, his spindly body being illuminated by the moonlight. Face tilted, eyes squinting to the right. He was as frightening as I remembered him to be. He must have sensed me, because as soon as I saw him, he started ringing the bell again. I shivered in fear and began calling for my sister, making sure to keep my voice down to a whisper. "Fatima," I said urgently. "Fatima, wake up." She didn't move. "Please," I said, my voice cracking. The bell continued to ring. She slowly began to stir in her bed, and the ringing immediately stopped. She yawned and looked at me. "What happened?" Her eyes beginning to widen as she saw fear. "Oh, come on." Her eyes beginning to widen as she saw the fear in my eyes. "It's him," I whispered, tears running down my face. "He's outside." She immediately jerked upright and pulled aside the curtains. There was no one there. "There's no one," she said, looking at me suspiciously. "Go back to sleep." I immediately knew that she didn't believe me, and that she thought I was making it all up, including what I said had happened earlier in the evening. She pulled the curtains back and went off to sleep again. She might not have believed me, but I knew it was real. I was alert as I'd ever been, straining my ears for the sound of the bell, but it wouldn't come again that night. I checked my watch. It was 3 a.m. and I needed to pee. I tried to hold it in for as long as I could, but the time came and I just had to go. There was no way that I was going to wet the bed, even as scared as I was. After my bladder became intolerable, I decided to brave the journey to the bathroom. As I got to the bathroom door, I immediately knew that something was wrong. I could feel this presence inside, and I knew that I should have walked away then and there. But I pushed the door open with trembling hands, and my hunch was proven correct. I saw a figure in the dark corner, his back turned towards me. Even though I couldn't see him, I knew who he was. He began to furiously whisper, his soft voice sounding like it was coming from right next to me. Tring, tring, tring. Tring, tring, tring. I screamed with all my might and fell backwards. He turned, his eyes shining as they focused on me, and he gave me that fucked up smile of his. I began to crawl backwards, screaming my lungs out. I soon felt arms around me and jumped, thinking that he'd got to me. But no, it was Fatima. She was looking at him, her eyes wide in fear as she realized that I was speaking the truth all along. "Go get up," she screamed, and I got up and ran. The last thing I saw was Fatima trying to close the bathroom door, before I was out of the room and ran into the solid frame of my father. He pushed me aside and walked into our bedroom. I didn't stop running until I found my mother, and quickly wrapped myself around her legs, crying hysterically. She began to comfort me, running her hand through my hair. Just when I thought the madness was coming to an end, my father let out a yell, full of such anguish that I had never heard in his voice before, or ever would again. Ami quickly walked to our room, with me following closely behind, albeit a little reluctantly. She too let out a painful scream as she entered the room, and I understood why. What I saw there chilled me to the bone, and has haunted me to this day. Fatima's lifeless body was lying on her bed, with large tufts of cotton candy sticking out of her mouth. Next up in our rainy evening is I was trapped in a hallway with no ending. A fine original work by Black Friday's Witch 13. Andrews Exchange Enterprises. I blankly stared off into the distance at the newly hung sign on the wall, lost in my thoughts, thinking about an article I'd read over coffee this morning. It was about a woman who'd won the lottery and quit her job to build homes for the less fortunate in third world countries. I imagine what it must be like to have that type of freedom. The sound of a jackhammer rattled in an obscure part of our office building. I'd grown accustomed to the sound these last several months as they worked on some upgrades to our shipping warehouse. My phone buzzed me out of my daydream. "Jessica, may I see you in my office?" It was my boss, Mr. Hewley, on my phone. "Sure thing, Mr. Hewley. I'll be right in." I sighed to myself. If there's one thing I hated, it was when my boss wanted to see me in his office, because that was never a good sign. I grabbed a notepad, a pen, and took one large gulp of my now lukewarm coffee, and made my way towards Mr. Hewley's office. To get there, you had to walk back towards our shipping warehouse. It was a bit of a hike all the way there. Well, what could he want? As far as I knew, I'd not done anything wrong to warrant a reprimand. I hadn't called off sick in over a year, nor had he made any mistakes worth mentioning, because I'd just had my annual review the week before, and even received a raise. I was nervous, though, because he never asked to see me unless something was wrong. The last time he called me into his office was the week I was hired, to tell me I'd made several mistakes that needed correction. That was 5 years ago now. When I got to his door, it was closed, so I knocked gently on it. "Come in." His voice was stern. I walked in and quietly shut the door behind me. "Jessica, please sit down." I sat down, my hands trembling slightly from my anxiety. "There's an issue with these reports James dropped off. I was wondering if you could help me decipher them." He smiled, and I became at ease. I took a deep breath and took the paper he handed to me. "What exactly am I looking for, sir?" "The numbers in regards to recent shipments are all off. The products he mentioned aren't even something we would have ordered. Says most of the products were ordered from us from India. It makes no sense. We only get our tool parts from China. $2 million mistake." I could see the sweat on his brow beckoning to be wiped away. I studied the orders. Then I saw the mistake. How did Mr. Hewley miss it? Well, it appears as though the order was cancelled and a reorder was created 2 days later. It's red-lined here. It was an honest mistake because the company you order from has a similar name to the company in India. Mr. Hewley looked at me as though he didn't believe it. So I pointed towards the bottom of the shipping receipt. Oh, shame, he said under his breath. I had to let go of James when we caught the error yesterday. I looked at Mr. Hewley in shock. Oh, I had no idea, I said, genuinely amazed because James had been a model employee. He'd never made a single error in the 5 years I'd been with the company. I need you to walk this over to accounting so they can correct the books. That's all for now. Thank you, Jessica. You've become a prime example of what this company needs. I smiled, relieved. My anxiety was gone for the time being. However, I did feel terrible for my ex-co-worker, James. I thought about James and what a nice guy he was as I left Mr. Hewley's office. I'd miss his polite demeanour and corny jokes. I was in a bit of a daze after what I'd learned only moments before as I made my way to the accounting department. I walked down the long hallway and turned right. I was still looking at the report when I realized I'd hit a dead end. There was a door at the end, so I stopped in my tracks. I thought there was a door that led to the warehouse from this hallway. Oh, I must have been mistaken. I turned around and walked back the way I'd come from, making my way around the corner. Only the way I'd come from was now a dead end as well. How did I make this mistake? I need to pay closer attention. I needed to get these updated corrections to accounting. I became even more nervous at the thought of Mr. Hewley reprimanding me if it wasn't done properly. Well, he often checked up on your work and what you were doing throughout the day, and he even had spies. I was afraid he was already on the phone with the accounting department to see if I'd taken over the reports explaining the mistake. Why hadn't the accounting department caught the error? Well, I was growing more concerned when I got to the end of the hallway, and once again, it was a wall. There was no exit, except to go back the way I came. The walls were clean and freshly painted white, except for black and white paintings of a woman standing by a window. I began to think maybe I'd only made a wrong turn once again, since the building had recently been under construction. Took a deep breath and walked back towards where I thought I'd come. I heard a group of men coming round the corner. I smiled and waved at them, trying to grab their attention. "Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to the accounting department?" Well, I think since the renovations in this building, it's caused me to lose my sense of direction. I made a wrong turn. 3 men, all in suits, stopped and looked at me. They said nothing to me, as if someone pressed the pause button on them. They watched me blankly, and then 2 more men walked up behind them. "Can you tell me which way accounting is?" Now I had 5 men all staring at me in suits. Perhaps they were foreign. We had visitors from other countries all the time. "English?" I was met with more blank stares. I felt stupid as the thought occurred to me that if they were visiting, they might not know where accounting was either. Then they turned to look at each other, and almost as if someone pressed play, they began walking towards me. The strange men walked around me, all talking in unison. I couldn't seem to make out a word they were saying. They continued past me, walking around the corner, and I heard a door slam shut. I followed in their direction, but I couldn't find the door that they would have left from. Bewildered, I stood to look from right to left, up and down. I heard footsteps behind me, and I turned to see James. "Oh, hello, Jessica." He smiled at me. "Did Mr. Hewley hire you back? If so, I'm so glad." "Hire me back?" he chuckled. "Yes, the error on the shipping report." He looked at me, confused. I finally gave up. "Oh, never mind. I'm trying to find my way to the accounting department." "Oh, that's easy peasy," he smiled. "First door on your right at the end of the hallway." I'd just come from that end of the hallway. "James, this might sound like an odd request, but could you walk me towards the door?" "Yeah, of course, Jessica," he grinned. He walked me towards that part of the hallway, and sure enough, there was a door. Over it was a sign that said, accounting. Relieved, I thanked him and went in. I was ecstatic. I'd finally gotten to my destination. When I walked into the accounting office, the head of accounting, Julia, greeted me with a smile. There was a rather large mess on the floor. Her computer was on the floor next to a very crooked desk. Above her was a large hole in the ceiling where a cement block had been dropped. It was a construction accident. Can you believe it? If I'd come through that door 15 moments earlier, you would have walked in as this was happening, Julia said, clearly still shaking but grinning from ear to ear in shock. Oh, are you okay? I asked. Yeah, just so happens my daughter's school called me seconds before. I couldn't get reception, so I had to leave the room. Peanut allergy concern after she came in contact with a friend's sandwich. Ooh, such a crazy Monday. I gave Julia the updated shipping order and then left as a crew of construction workers were coming in to assess the damage. I made it back to my desk when Tessa, our receptionist, came up to me crying. Oh my God. Tears were falling down her face. Tessa, my God, what happened? Oh, I just heard the most horrible news. James from shipping was found in his living room after he'd hung himself. They think it's because that mean old Mr. Hewley fired him. How? I'd seen him just moments ago. I checked a day later. There was an obituary stating he'd passed away. I'm grateful that I'm alive and not seriously injured from the construction accident. I don't fully understand what happened that day in the hallway, or if it was a glitch. One thing's for sure. I'm still afraid to go down that hallway, and haven't since. We round up our stories for this rainy evening with The Last Drive-In Theatre I Ever Visited, an original work by Zuka 101. This is the story of a monster. My name's Harold Brown. I'm 6'1", built like a Viking. Short and thick tree trunk legs, huge torso, big paunch, thick blonde hair, blue eyes, hair everywhere, and gigantic arms capped by ham-sized fists. Suffice to say, when I go to Renaissance fairs, it's always as William Wallace. I go to a university in California, one of the last good ones, a hidden gem, really. And 5 months ago, I met my girlfriend, Cassandra. How we met is the stuff of, at once, dreams and nightmares. I was behind her in a drive-thru late at night and saw some guy climb into her car. I followed after her, frantically honking and flashing my brakes to get her attention. But she evaded me, not knowing of the monster hiding behind her. Because I grew up on the farms and ranches surrounding this town, I quickly located the back roads they'd gone down and called in the police. Cassandra was still alive. I met with her again after she was released from the hospital. Yeah, I knew I had to ask her out after the cops tried to take the bag of fast food that was in her car for evidence, and she ferociously snatched it back and mauled the burger in half a minute, in spite of being starkers and red as a tomato from head to toe, thanks to the bleach she'd been dunked in by that psycho. Coffee, movies, the great hole-in-the-wall restaurants I know around town, none of which were drive-through, since she'd officially sworn off of them. And whatever else a pair of students on a shoestring budget could manage. Her cascade of wine-red hair, which reminded me of my field of study, her mother-of-pearl skin and her vibrant blue eyes all marked a young woman who knew her way around an animal cell. I'd regale her with talk of wine and winemaking, geekery, the time I was shot while working as a security guard at the Santa Barbara County Fair and Expo, and books I grew up with, Star Wars' expanded universe, Raptor Red and Snow Crash, if you must know. And she would bless my ears with descriptions of cellular mitosis, Star Trek, which got her into science because Mr. Spock's her hero. Oh, and Mystery Science Theater 3000. I was already a fan, but she helped me truly appreciate the skits in between the movie segments. She'd call me her big Viking wolf. I call her my little Spitfire fox. To be honest, I probably wouldn't have met or talked to her or any other girl there at that university. It's not that I'm shy. Of the Myers-Briggs personality types, I'm an INFJ. Introverted, intuitive, feeling, judging. The rarest of them all. Great privacy, but great empathy. A healer, a crowd pleaser, but someone preferring their alone time and their own headspace. But more than just that. I struggle with feelings of intense self-hatred. None of which manifest on the surface because my nurturing nature doesn't want to spread that around. How do I find validation? Through helping others. Counseling helped and probably saved my life. But that self-hatred still pops up. All of it prompted by a traumatic 3 years when I was 9 at the hands of an ex-sister-in-law. But for now, these days, I'd managed to find a wonderful young woman who saw past my imperfections to the person under the carefully constructed mask. Dating bliss at last. We had to be careful, though. In our town, there's a significant homeless population, and some gangs, too. Most of the latter didn't bother with students, unless someone was behind on a drug tab, and most students' vices were beer and video games. And the former, well, they were usually pretty chill. There's even a mural of one, dubbed the Pirate, thanks to his eye patch and haggard demeanor. Every time a student would see him, they'd pump a fist and shout, "Arr, matey," and the pirate would shout, "Arr, matey," back. Nice guy. Loves Dos Equis beer, and if you buy him a drink or sandwich, he'll regale you with stories from his time working on a freight ship that are so outlandish and so ridiculous, they absolutely must be true. Unicorn Man. So named for the single dreadlock sticking up from his head at all times. He was a professor at the university until something he was researching just broke his mind. The Cop, named because of the tattered police shirt and cop hat he wore, was an abandoned Down syndrome baby, but the man could be trusted to walk women safely home on dark and frightening nights. Yeah, real class act, the Cop. Then there's some of the unsafe ones. The Martian, who thinks aliens are going to invade. Pigpen, who's only held together by all the parasites he carries holding hands. And Tapeworm, who was a dried-up, crap-spattered tail sticking out of his hands that's composed of the half-dead tapeworms dangling out of him, and keeps yelling about how his son was taken by polar bears. He was just a student that cracked from pressure and never went home. He'd become violent towards anyone with a small dog or cat, demanding they give him his son back and spend a night in jail. Once upon a time, we had institutions that helped these people, but because a relative few psychos turned them into their own personal Dr. Mengele playgrounds, they mostly got closed down. Things everywhere would have been different if these folks got the help they needed. But, I digress. One evening, when we'd finished our studies over a plate of taquitos and guacamole that had grown cold and limp and dark green, respectively, Cassandra looked up from her book and shut it with a heavy thud. "Let's go see a movie," she exclaimed, grinning that adorable way that she did. "Oh, as long as it's not the Star Wars prequel," I groaned. She scoffed, as if you even had to say it. "After what Jar Jar Abrams did to Star Trek, I'm not wasting time on that hooey." See? Dream woman. "Okay, so, how about Ant-Man?" I asked. "Oof, I haven't seen much in way of the Marvel movies." She shrugged. "Got one you want to see, then?" I asked as I stood up, slipping my huge work boots on. The boots, Cassandra joked, could be used as lifeboats in the event of a catastrophic flood. "I don't know. What do you want to see?" she asked, twirling a strand of that red hair around a finger. Very helpful, Foxy. Well, Mad Max Fury Road sounds like fun, I supplied. She tilted her head in thought. I'd shown her all 3 movies after I discovered our mutual love of Fallout, and she liked Thunderdome the most. Well, I'm more of a Road Warrior fan myself. Okay, Fury Road it is, she chirped. It was wonderful to see her cheering and smiling like this. She was shaky and paranoid the first month after her ordeal, but, well, time, dates, and distracting schoolwork and recreation has got a way of helping you forget the horrors that have been visited upon you. I checked the listings on my phone, and the only showing that would conclude at a civilized time was at a drive-in theatre. It had been in town for as long as anyone could remember, near a trailer park. Every Sunday, there'd be a swap meet there, and on occasion, we'd pay a visit to see what second-hand goodies we could find. I mentioned this, and Cassandra hesitated, biting her lip anxiously. Hey, it's all right. We can wait for another showing. We'll find another movie, I said with a smile, scratching my fingers up and down her back the way she liked. No, it's okay. Let's go. I shouldn't let some scary crap define me for the rest of my life. She shot to her feet, a fist melodramatically thrust in the air. God, what a dog. What a beautiful, wonderful dog. Taking my truck, we stopped at a gas station on the way to grab snacks. Since movie theater snack prices are usually somewhere between kidney and firstborn child. But, at Cassandra's insistence, we got fresh popcorn from the concession stand. I've got to support the local business after all. Fortunately, we like our popcorn the same way, drenched in that fluid they somehow get away with calling butter, and generously salted to the point that the mere sight of the torso-sized tub of pop kernels caused our arteries to shrivel up like twigs. Armed with our gas station candy, sodas and popcorn, we drove to a spot, tuned the radio to the drive-in frequency, and relaxed. Ahead of us, another couple in a little blue Prius were watching, frequently tearing themselves away to steal kisses while the cocker-spaniel dog in the back stole mouthfuls of popcorn. Well, I relaxed. Cassandra kept reaching into her purse to feel the comforting grip of her taser, the same one that had ended the life of her would-be murderer. She eventually settled down, sampled some popcorn, nibbled on her Snickers bar, and sipped at her soda pop. The film was extremely exciting, and it drew Cassandra in. I kept looking over at her, making sure she felt comfortable and was enjoying herself. That was more important to me than the film. Around the time Max blew up the guy decked out in ammo, I want that hat now, by the way, the intermission came. 15 minutes to get out of the car, relax, get a snack or use the facilities. Cassandra needed the latter most, and before asking me to go with her, I offered to escort her myself. Making sure I locked my truck, smiling reassuringly at her, I took her along to the restrooms. One of these brick affairs set up near the same building they kept the projectors in and sold concessions from. I waited outside and surveyed the dark landscape of cars, watching snacks and drinks dance invitingly on the screen. Yeah, real subtle. I leaned against the bricks near the women's restroom entrance, gazing up at the stars. You can make out most of them, given the small size of the towns around here. I heard jingling and clicking approaching from the drive-thru and glanced down, seeing the dog, that popcorn-stealing cocker-spaniel, trotting along, leash trailing behind it. Uh-oh, looks like we got a jailbreaker, I exclaimed with a laugh, bringing my giant boot down on the leash before leaning down to seize it. Let's get you back to your folks, silly boy. I walked the dog back towards our spot, and noticed the car ahead of my truck had its driver door wide open and was completely empty. I glanced towards the concession stand, spotting a few people, but none of them looked like the couple from the car. I started to walk towards it, when the dog became immediately agitated, barking, growling and making a real fuss. Easy now, buddy. It's all right. I consoled the unhappy canine. I'm sure they're okay. That sounded like a hollow lie, even to myself. I slowly rounded the back of the couple's car and peered into the cabin. It was completely dark, so I fished out my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it into the parked Prius. Dark, red, soaking the upholstery and the console. Oh my God. I saw a bloody hand sticking out from under the car, and the dog let out a mournful whimper. I scooped him up under one arm and scrambled like the devil himself when nipping at my heels, darting back to the concession stand. I banged a fist on the door to the women's restroom. "Occupied," Cassandra snarled from inside. "Give me a minute." "Cassie, baby, lock the door in there. Don't unlock it," I bellowed, then staggered to the concession stand, scaring the crap out of the poor, acne-riddled freshman with dark circles under his eyes, manning the place. "Holy shit, dude," he yelped, bloodshot eyes widening in surprise. "Listen, call the police. Someone's been hurt," I yelled. He stared at me for a few moments, jaw slack. What?" A skeptical mumble struggled its way from his mouth. "Murder. Call cops freaking now," I bellowed, banging my fist on the counter for emphasis, then ran all the way back to the truck, panting hard. I tossed the dog into the back and snatched Cassandra's taser from her purse. I spun around just in time to see a dirty, haggard face framed by stringy, greasy hair and a pair of venomously angry, dark brown eyes boring into mine. I got a half second to let out a startled shout before I felt a cold impact in my abdomen, accompanied by a rigid stiffness. It was tapeworm, and he just buried an old kitchen knife in my belly. I could tell it had penetrated abdominal muscles, but where the knife wound up, it was mostly adipose that was pierced. And the thick shall inherit the earth. I'm a gentle soul by nature, and can count on one hand the number of fights I've been in. One time when I was in 4-H, one more thing I have in common with Cassie, I held off a gang of kids from beating up my little brother. At Boy Scout camp, I got into a fight with a big lummox who picked on me excessively. And thirdly, I was shot in the torso by an idiot punk with his idiot girlfriend because they wanted to get into the fair after closing hours. I did the same thing when stabbed that I did when shot. I became enraged. I have a deep-seated rage issue stemming from a ruined childhood at the hands of the ex-sister-in-law, the one I mentioned earlier, who tortured me whenever no one was around. From between when I was 9 years old to when I was 12, when my brother divorced her for unrelated reasons, well, I never told anyone what happened, save for the counselors, and frankly, that's a lengthy story for another time. But I always found outlets for that rage, so it never controlled me. Games, a little time at the sharpshooting range, a little kickboxing. It vented perfectly. But when this poor, broken and delusional man stabbed me, it was something he immediately regretted. My vision reddened and I leaped forward, the same way I had after that chisel-jawed punk put a bullet in me. I brought my fists down on him, muscle toned from long hours on the farm and ranch I grew up on, burning as I struck him across the face as he screamed. "Son, get out the truck. Run away, boy. Get help," he cried to the cocker spaniel whose owners he'd butchered in a delusional stupor as I rained one blow after another down on him. You know that little bit of restraint you have? That restraint that keeps you from putting your full potential strength into a blow. That well-trained part of your superego that has told you it's not good to hit people. Well, in that moment, as in the 3 fights of my life before, that restraint fell away as I broke his jaw, cracked his cheekbone, felt his ribs crack under my unrelenting and brutal assault, as all the built-up rage, frustration, and grief inside me poured out into this man. Somewhere in all this fray, the knife had come out of me, and I was bleeding all over. By the time the police arrived, I was standing over him and was bringing a size 13 triple E work boot down on his femur, snapping it like a toothpick. All the while, the movie continued. It seems the kid in the booth was too shaken to think to turn it off. And while Immortan Joe was driving his souped-up hot rod on the big screen, the rest of the drive-in's patrons watched on, oblivious to the mayhem happening less than 100 feet away. The cops shone their light on me. I heard them bellow at me to stop, and when I looked up at them, the rage burned still. And according to the dashcam footage I later saw, thanks to a friend of the family in the police department, they had just cause to believe I was about to attack them. This distraction, though, was enough for my gentle side, what I hope is my real self, to grab the reins again. The adrenaline rush ebbed, and after taking one step, my strength left me, like the blood of mine pooled around my feet. I collapsed. I have faint memories of Cassandra walking alongside the gurney that the paramedics had managed to get my giant self onto, holding my hand. She called me her warrior, her protector, her knight in shining armor. Please, no, baby, don't call me those things. She rode with me to the hospital, and I woke up to her and my family gathered around. Cassie's dorm mates were even there. Nicole, the activist girl, Jeannie, the nice but bubble-headed beauty queen who had yet to pick a major, and the perpetually cheerful and extra thick goth, Gloria. My brothers joked about how I needed to get a slash on my torso, and my battle damage would be complete after I'd been shot and stabbed now. Mum and Dad were their usual supportive selves. Cassandra kept calling me brave, heroic, and mighty. No, I'm none of those things. The detective who came to interview me, Jack Cunningham, explained that the couple that Tapeworm had attacked had not survived their injuries. Wow, you really tore up that guy, Cunningham said. I felt sick to my stomach. And not because of the dull pain where I'd been stabbed, which was throbbing with infection that a cocktail of painkillers and antibiotics was battling. I looked away from him, trying to hide my shame. Then he grinned. Can't say he didn't deserve it, Cunningham said. No, God no, don't say that. Am I going to jail? I mumbled. This completely falls under self-defense, but you beat the guy to within an inch of his life, and he's probably going to end up in the funny farm, the detective said. This is what it took. This is what it takes before people who need it get sent someplace where they can't hurt others or themselves. Oh. I'll come back with more questions and paperwork, but you go on and heal up, hero. This is pretty cut and dry, he said, giving me a thumbs up on his way out. Friends and family drifted in and out over the next week, and even the pirate sent a card saying, Tape wasn't right in the head. Shame this happened. Get well soon, brother. It included a gift certificate for a big bottle of honey jacks. After I got out, I would frequently glance at the other homeless folk. No, not because I was afraid of being attacked, but looking for a scowl, a frown, a dirty look, something, anything to validate how loathsome I felt. Nothing of the sort. Why couldn't people see in me what I know exists? I finally went back to my dorm, hand in hand with Cassandra in one, and the leash of the newly adopted Cocker Spaniel in the other. And after sitting down, I hammered this whole story out. The monster I mentioned when I began? No, it wasn't tapeworm. Beating a handicapped man with no control over his actions got labelled a heroic act. It sure as hell doesn't feel heroic. The monster I referred to lives inside me, the Hyde to my Jekyll. I know, on the surface, that I'd never hurt the ones I love, even when angry. But a primal fear always hides deep down. Our brains are divided into many different parts. Know why you get a headache looking at optical illusions? That's your brain arguing over what it's seeing. And whatever part of my brain that monster lives in, I pray to all that's good and holy that it's never unleashed again. That's why I've gone back to counseling. Cassandra says she's proud of me for it. She's the only one I've ever told any of this to. Well, until now. And I'll tell you all what she told me. You're worth healing. You're worth helping. You're worth being happy. I implore you, friends, battle those demons in your soul. Don't do it alone. Once we graduate, I'm going to ask Cassandra to marry me. My tabletop game friends, Raoul and Mandy, gave me an engagement ring to give to her when the time's right. Well, I'm thinking Pismo Beach at the end of the pier, right when the moon is hovering over the ocean. Just not at a drive-in movie anytime soon. Always shut the outer door before you turn the outside light off. That was the only thing written on the little post-it note left for me by the previous homeowner. I didn't think much of it at the time I discovered it. I was busy moving into my first home, had tons of boxes I still needed to move from the U-Haul into the house, and I couldn't be bothered to keep track of a scribbled-on piece of paper left on the kitchen counter. The last few months before the move had been a bit of a whirlwind for me. At 26, I'd just published my first novel. It was actually selling pretty well. With money coming into my bank account in large amounts, I decided that it was time to move out of my one-bedroom apartment and find myself an actual house. I also decided it was time to move out of the overcrowded city and give myself some space to breathe. So, I began to search for some property out in the country. It took a little while, but I eventually found the house. Not too big, not too small. It was just off a county road that led deep into farmlands. There were neighbours, but their driveways were about a 5-minute walk from mine. Not too far, but not too close either. The price of the place was very reasonable as well, far lower than what I'd expected. This raised some suspicions in my mind, but after numerous inspections and walkthroughs turned up nothing wrong with not only the house but the property in general, I just thought I'd gotten extremely lucky and bought the place soon after the last walkthrough. Now, the really great thing about the house was that even though it was somewhat removed from civilization, it still had plenty of decent creature comforts. It was a newer house, so electricity and plumbing weren't a problem. There is decent cell service, and the previous owners did some renovations to give the place a more rustic look. There are woods surrounding my house, but the tree line is a fair distance off, so I can observe nature without worrying that a storm will have nature come crashing through my windows. There are wild animals like coyotes and bears nearby, but I picked up a Remington 870 shotgun before I moved, and my wonderful companion Shadow, an almost pure black border collie, has always let me know when there were visitors, both welcome and not, to our abode. Shadow took to our new home like a fish to water. She loved to sniff around at all the new smells of the outdoors, chase squirrels, and explore with me through the many pines, oaks, and ashes that littered the woods behind us. We moved in during May, and the summer was an absolutely fantastic one. Friends came over, barbecues were had, many nights were spent stargazing. But then fall came. The trees changed colours, the warmth drained from the air, and the troubles began to appear. Shadow is very routine-oriented. Always has to have breakfast at a certain time, a walk at a certain time, and has to be let outside to do her business at a certain time. It was one night in early September that I noticed something weird that she was doing. During the summer, when she was let out into the backyard at night, she would wander past where the back porch light would illuminate, nose to the ground. I never had a problem with this because she always came back when I called. And yet, one night, I noticed that when she was let out, she wandered to the edge of the illumination and came to an abrupt stop. I couldn't see too clearly, but I did see her posture shift into one of aggression. And through the chirps of crickets and other noises of night creatures, I heard a low growl from her. This was surprising to me, as Shadow wasn't very aggressive. Sure, she'd bark whenever someone came to the door, but I'd never heard her growl at anything before. So naturally, when I heard her growl at the darkness beyond my backyard light, red flags immediately popped up in my mind. I keep a high-powered flashlight next to my back door, so I grabbed it and shone it out into the blackness of my backyard. Nothing abnormal was highlighted in the massive beam of illumination that came from my flashlights. Just grass, weeds, and the first line of trees that was the gateway into the forest beyond. I swerved the beam of light back and forth a few times, but still saw nothing out of the ordinary. In the minute I spent trying to see what it was that freaked my dog out, she'd done her business and was now coming back inside the house, seemingly relaxed again. I shrugged the whole thing off as a dog being a dog, closed my back door, and continued my night as normal. The next night, however, the strange ritual was performed again. Shadow went outside, went to the edge of the light, stopped suddenly, and began to growl at the night that surrounded her. Once again, warning bells went off in my head, and I grabbed the flashlight again. Scanning the surrounding area had the same results as the previous night. But seeing Shadow relax again within a minute and do her business, well, I thought it was just an animal scent from far away that Shadow could smell, but I couldn't. These nightly incidents did not stop, however, and after a week, I figured it was something Shadow had just started doing. I didn't pay it any mind whatsoever. Well, that came to an end on a night that a new moon was in place. The backyard was darker than usual, and the only light at all came from my back porch light. I let Shadow out, but she only went a few feet out of the door before she stopped in her tracks, ears perked and tail standing straight up. She lowered her head and began to growl lowly, her hackles standing on end. This night, I didn't have to wonder what was going on. My animal instincts were screaming at me that something was out there in the dark, and it was not friendly at all. Worst of all, I had the feeling that whatever creature lurked about in the abyss, it was watching us. Only a few seconds after I'd opened the door, I reached over and grabbed my flashlight, turning it on quickly and wildly swinging the beam of light through the murk. As the light crossed the tree line, I distinctly heard the sound of something scampering back into the woods before my light could reveal what it was. With the absence of whatever that thing was, my lizard brain calmed down, and I even saw Shadow ease up a bit, though she still went to the bathroom near the house and wasted no time coming back inside. I, however, stood still in the doorway, waiting to see if I could hear any sign of our unwelcome visitor coming back. After a few minutes of crickets chirping, nightbirds calling, and my nerves still being relaxed, I closed the door, shut off the light, and went to bed. Things were calm for the next 2 weeks. Shadow didn't get tense anymore going outside at night, and I was assured our troubles with whatever was out there were over. I even began to hang out in the backyard at night, with the back porch light off, so I could look up at the stars without any light pollution. That came to an abrupt end one cloudy, cold October night. Even though it was cloudy enough to cover both the moon and the stars, I was stubborn and decided to stick it out and wait for the clouds to dissipate. I was sitting in my stargazing chair, one of those chairs you can lie back on and it stretches out so you can actually lie back and stare straight up, and I'd been listening to a lo-fi channel on YouTube. I didn't have the most comfortable headphones in, so after a while I decided to give my ears a break and took them off. Silence greeted me, utter and complete. None of the nighttime noises I'd gotten used to were in the air. Only the sound of me breathing and my own heart beating. In moments, my fight-or-flight instinct kicked into gear. I knew that nature shouldn't be this quiet, and the instinctual terror I'd felt weeks ago came rushing back into me with double the intensity. I scrambled out of my chair, disconnecting my headphones from my phone in my graceless tumble backwards, and was booking it for my back door. As I ran, I didn't hear any footfalls from behind me, yet I did manage to catch the distinct crunch of someone stepping on and crushing my headphones, assuring me that there was indeed something behind me in the dark, and it was coming after me. I got to my back door, thanking God I hadn't locked it, opened it, and stepped inside. I tried to turn on the back porch light, my hands fumbling in fear for a moment before I got it. In that moment, I knew the light had turned on, and before I had a chance to turn around, I heard something from behind me. It was the sharp rustling of grass and of earth being dug up. I turned around, grasping at the flashlight hanging beside me, while trying to spot what had made the noise. Nothing was in the ring of light cast by my back porch light, and when I got the flashlight up and shone it around the yard, it revealed that nothing was there. As I stood in the doorway, scanning the night, Shadow came up beside me. She already had her hackles raised and began growling into the night right beside me. I knew something was up, and so I decided to call out. "Is anyone there?" I called into the night, not really expecting an answer. "Seriously, if someone's out there, I'm armed and you're freaking me out. I don't want to shoot anyone, but if you keep messing with me, I won't hesitate." Silence was my reply, with the slow ambience of crickets and nighttime animals returning at last. Shadow was much more relaxed as well, so I began to think I just scared myself over nothing. But then my flashlight beam came across something odd on the ground. Right outside of the edge of light created by my porch light, I noticed upturned grass and dirt, a large patch of it. I stared at it in confusion for a moment, wondering what it was, when a memory from childhood popped into my head. I used to play soccer, and sometimes when you were running fast and had to stop quickly, you'd dig your cleats into the grass, tearing up the field and bringing you to a halt. The patch in my backyard looked exactly like that, but I couldn't make myself believe someone had been silently chasing me in cleats. No, whatever had made that had to have been some animal, but animals don't wear shoes with cleats, so the closest thing to cleats some animal might have would be claws. The next day, I called up my local fish and wildlife agency. I described to them the incident and asked them what they thought it could have been. They told me it might have been a bobcat, but I insisted that it couldn't have been. I wouldn't want to tussle with a bobcat, but I highly doubt one could have invoked the primal fear that I'd felt. I asked if there was a potential for the creature being a mountain lion, but I was told we lived too far south for them. With some persistence, I managed to get them to agree that they would send an agent out near my area to investigate. Later that night, when it was time for Shadow to go outside, I grabbed my shotgun and loaded it. Shadow seemed a bit more at ease when she went outside, but I wasn't going to take any chances, and I stood in the doorway with a slug in the chamber, waiting for something to rear its ugly head out of the darkness. Nothing came of it, but throughout the entire time, I felt like I was being observed by something out in the night. Things went on like this for a few days, until one Saturday when I was doing a little gardening next to the side of my house, and I began to dig up the dirt underneath my kitchen window. I stopped when I saw strange impressions in the ground. Looking closer, I saw that they were a faint imprint of track, and following them, I found they circled around my entire home, always stopping at one of the windows, and then picking up again to go to the next window. My blood ran cold at this discovery. Not only were these tracks in no way human, as it didn't look like any shoe print I'd seen before, but whatever was making these seemed to have been profiling my home, and was smart enough to be going to my windows to check for a way in. I started to feel like a prisoner in my own home, and I did not like that. I decided to wait one night to see if I could catch whatever was doing this. That night, we did the same usual routine, but I acted calmly, like nothing was bothering me. When Shadow came back inside, I shut the door and flipped off the back porch light as usual. But instead of getting ready for bed, I shut off all the house lights, grabbed my shotgun, and waited by the back door. I spent a long time sitting in the dark by the back door, trying to remain calm through my anticipation of whatever was going to come skulking out of the blackness. Hours went by, and I was eventually becoming tired and had difficulty keeping my eyes open. The silence outside and the slow, steady rhythm of my kitchen clock ticking away was almost enough to put me under. Suddenly, a realization hit me, and my eyes shot wide open. It was dead quiet outside. No usual nighttime sounds, just like that night a few weeks back. I placed my ear against the door and tried to listen through it. For the first minute or two, I couldn't hear anything. My ears must have gotten used to the silence, however, as shortly after, I began to faintly pick up the sound of grass being crushed underfoot. It seemed to be coming from the left side of my house and coming closer to the door. It softly stopped, and as I strained to listen, a new sound cut through the darkened home. Light tapping, coming from my kitchen window not 6 feet away from my sitting form. The breath froze in my lungs. Something was at my kitchen window, tapping away quietly. I tried to crane my neck to see if I could see what was causing the sound, but from where I was sitting, I didn't have a good angle. I slowly began to shift my position to get a better look. With my shotgun, which I'd forgotten was leaned up against the doorframe next to me, decided it had had enough standing up and chose right then and there to clatter loudly to the ground next to me. The tapping at the window immediately stopped, and I cursed myself and the firearm internally for being in the situation I was in now. I pressed my ear to the door again, but heard no noises coming from outside. I stayed like this for a good minute or so, trying my hardest to hear any noise that originated past the door. An idea formed in my head. Not a good one, but I didn't know what else to do at the time. Timidly, but loud enough for those close by to hear, I called out, "Hello." I waited with bated breath for a few seconds, but nothing happened. I waited apprehensively for a few more, and still there were no sounds. I let out a sigh, thinking nothing was there and maybe I'd hallucinated the taps on the windows. Suddenly, an explosive burst of sound came from the other side of the door. I distinctively heard the sound of clawed feet running up my back porch steps, and only had a second to prepare when something crashed heavily into my back door. The next couple of moments were pure chaos. Shadow was awoken and started barking from somewhere in the house. I was letting loose a stream of curses and cries of terror, and whatever was on the other side of the door began pounding on it. Through its banging, I distinctly remember hearing whatever was on the other side making a guttural growl that seemed to be a cross between a snake's hiss and a cat's aggressive yowl. In my panic, I grabbed my shotgun and got to my feet, pointing the gun at the door and crying out, "Stop it! Go away! Leave us alone!" Now, my old back door used to have a pane of glass about eye level to me, which is about 6 feet tall. As I stood there, quivering with fear, gun at the ready, a pair of eyes came into view from the other side of the glass. They were larger than any humans, and they were bright yellow, with slit-like pupils you see in a snake's eyes. When they caught sight of me, the banging stopped, and I could hear this thing's laboured breathing. It was panting while looking at me, and some old animalistic instinct deep inside me told me those eyes were the eyes of a predator, and it was looking hungrily at its prey. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen with fear. Part of me wanted to shoot at the thing, but I didn't want to damage the only barrier that stood between this creature and me. I then realized Shadow's barking was a lot louder, and looking to my side, I saw she stood next to me, barking, growling, and baring her teeth at the thing behind the door. Looking back up, I saw the yellow eyes shift downward to look at Shadow, and the guttural growl again came through the door. "Oh, no, you don't," I cried, anger suddenly flowing through my veins. "You keep your freaking eyes off of my dog." No way was I going to let this thing that dragged itself from the darkened woods lay one clawed finger on my fur baby. I rushed to the door, turning on the porch light to get a better shot before going for the door lock with my other free hand, steeling myself to blast the bastard and fight to the death to keep my baby girl safe. It turns out I didn't have to. For the moment the porch light turned on, the eyes disappeared from the pane of glass, and I heard the most tormented and fearful howl I've ever heard from man or beast. I could hear the scraping of claws against my wooden deck, as whatever hellspawn that stood at the threshold of my house scrambled to get out of the light and run back to the safety of dark night. As I got the door open, I saw the shape of something large and tall, easily breaching 8 feet on 2 long, gaunt legs, tearing past the perimeter of light created by the back porch light, back into the pitch blackness of the surrounding forest. I didn't sleep that night, instead choosing to drink coffee with my shotgun in my hand until the sun rose. When I went to survey the damage in the morning light, I grimaced at the sight. My deck had massive, deep, gouged scratch marks in the wood. My back door had a large crack in it from where the thing had slammed into it, and a strip of my yard was torn up with the same claw marks that were on my deck. That morning, I called the local hardware store in town, about half an hour away. I explained the situation, leaving out that a monster had attacked, and saying instead that a deer had crashed into my door, and I asked if it was possible if they could get a heavy wooden door to replace mine, and if they could install it the same day. They referred me to a good contractor, who I called, and he said he could get it done today, especially after I told him I'd double his rate if he got it done. As I sat at my kitchen table, still shaken from the previous night's events, wondering what I was going to do tonight, I noticed a corner of a piece of paper sticking out from under the fridge. Curious, and looking for anything to take my mind off what I'd experienced, I rescued the paper from under the fridge and took a look at it. It was the note from the previous homeowner, the one I'd completely forgotten about. Its message about always shutting the outside door before turning the light off suddenly made much more sense to me. So did why the house was priced for so cheap. I cursed the previous owner for leaving me in the dark about this nighttime visitor. When the contractor arrived, he let out a long whistle as he surveyed the damage. "You said a deer crashed into your door. Must have been a hell of a thing chasing it to make those claw marks on your deck. You're lucky the door didn't break down. You'd have had a hell of a mess to clean up." I nodded glumly, feigning ignorance about the claw marks in my deck. As he was installing my new door, he noticed my porch light. "You know, I could run back to Earl's Hardware after I'm finished with this door, pick up a motion-activated floodlight and install it for you. I'm sure it'd help keep those nighttime critters away." Thank God for that man, because my brain at that time was so in shock, I hadn't even considered something like that. It seemed my nightly guest didn't like light, so a motion-activated light would keep it at bay forever. I thanked him profusely, taking him up on his offer. After that day, things went back to normal for a long time. Months went by, and even though I would tense up every time at night when I saw the motion light go off, I didn't find any tracks near my house. I never heard a trace of the creature anywhere near my property. I even asked my neighbors how things were going for them, and if they'd had any nightly disturbances. Their answer was always no, so I figured my problems were all over and done with. That is, I thought my problems were over until the later winter months, and I began to notice the motion light staying on for longer and longer durations. Shadow began to get scared, even stepping a foot outside when the sun went down, and I began to see the familiar odd tracks in the winter snow. Every couple of days, I'd see them move closer and closer towards the house. I swear I even heard that low, hissing growl one night. It floated up on the wind when I lingered by the open back door, wanting to see the stars. That door was shut and locked the moment the sound hit my ears. I was feeling like a prisoner in my own home again, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't find where the previous homeowner had gone, and none of the neighbors had anything like this happening to them. I thought the motion light was a surefire solution, but that was falling apart and I didn't know why. But then I found the note again, hidden under a pile of junk mail on my kitchen table. It still read the same ominous message it had when I first moved in, but desperation made me do something I hadn't done before. I flipped it over, and to my surprise, there was another message written on the back. Shooting it just makes it pissed. Only bright light will drive it away. Don't use the outside lights too much, though. It'll get used to them. Now I think I may be in some serious trouble. Shh, everyone. Hey, a lot of people are asleep right now after that 2-hour session, so let's just keep it down, shall we? A lovely little collection of stories for you there this evening. Did you enjoy those? Well, yeah, some of them have appeared over on my second channel, and, well, if you are subscribed to the second channel, thank you very much. I haven't been too active recently, but I plan to change that as soon as things calm down a little bit more. For those of you who are not familiar with the second channel, what the damn hell? Get yourself over there right now. Yeah, 2 or 3 of those have been on the second channel, but lots more short stories over there for your listening delight. So I hope to see you over there very soon. Well, that's enough for one evening. Hope you enjoy these ASMR type sessions. Back with something a bit different next time, but I'll be back again very soon. So until then, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.